Welcome to episode 66 of Published. Today I'll speak with publishing and strategy expert Janet Goldstein about the high-profile Penguin Random House and Simon Schuster antitrust lawsuit. We'll discuss the scope of the trial and what it means for the publishing industry as a whole and for burgeoning authors as they work to get their books published.
Welcome to Published, a podcast by Greenleaf Book Group, where we'll discuss the ins and outs of the publishing industry, from writing a book and finding the right publisher to gearing up for a book launch. And now, here's your host, Greenleaf Book Group CEO, Tanya Hall.
Welcome back to Published. In this episode, we discuss the Department of Justice's lawsuit against Penguin Random House and Simon Schuster in response to their proposed merger. Penguin Random House is already the largest book publisher in America, and by acquiring Simon & Schuster, many fear that this would make it harder for authors to get their books picked up, amongst other things. The approximately $2.2 billion deal would mean that instead of there being competition between the two big publishers for what would be top-selling titles, there could be less incentive to offer authors big advances. By driving down advances, this merger could affect the livelihood of authors who depend on those advances and cause dire effects across the entire industry. Other concerns are that with one less publishing option, authors might struggle even more to get their books seen. With all of this buzz, I wanted to bring on Janet Goldstein to talk about her take and advice for authors that feel discouraged in light of this lawsuit. We'll discuss the importance of the trial, what it means for new authors, and how to navigate the changing publishing landscape. Let's get into the interview. Janet, welcome to Published. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great to be here. It's been a while.
It has been a while. So why don't we start off by having you tell our listeners a bit about yourself and what you do?
Absolutely. Well, I have done a lot of things in publishing, but I think the things to highlight is that I spent about 25 years at three of the big six publishers. And today it would be two of the big five publishers. And this will figure into the conversation we're going to have today. And I was on the editorial side and rose up the ranks to editorial director at HarperCollins, at a startup division, Broadway Books, at Random House, and then at Viking Penguin. I directed a spirituality list, did business books, did parenting books, did fiction, published the Dalai Lama. You know, people say, have you ever worked with anyone famous? I published David Allen with Getting Things Done. I published Harriet Lerner, who's having a whole renaissance. She wrote The Dance of Anger and The Dance of Intimacy, but she was a mentor and teacher to Brene Brown. So she's having a whole moment, lots of other things. And then I've been on my own as a publishing strategy consultant for about the past 15 years. I can't believe it. And I both collaborate on books and do some ghostwriting, but a lot of strategic planning with authors. I've done teaching at NYU. I had a stint at National Geographic Books. And interesting also for this call, I have one foot in traditional publishing and keep up with it and have clients and authors going the traditional route successfully. And I value it. And I have other clients going hybrid and self-publishing routes also very successfully. And it really depends on where you are on your track. So I'm thrilled to be here and share what I know.
Awesome. Yeah, I echo that. I often tell people there's no right or wrong. There might be a few wrong, but generally no right or wrong way to publish a book. And it's really, really coming down to the fit and your resources and your priorities and your goals. So we're not here to convince anyone one way or the other. It's just to make sure you're informed. Speaking of informed, so I don't want people to be quickly turning this off when they find out we're talking about a corporate merger today, but or a potential one. So maybe we should set the stage for our listeners so they understand why the potential Penguin Random House Simon and Schuster merger is our topic of discussion. And if you can, since you have such a deep background in traditional publishing, maybe give us the state of traditional publishing today and how it might change in the future, especially with an eye towards the consolidation that we've seen over the years.
Right, right. At the simplest level, I actually think big trade publishing is in a fairly solid state. They made huge adjustments to dealing with Amazon and the huge amount of business that goes through Amazon. That can be physical books, but that are purchased through Amazon and not through the local bookstore. There's now a really cool platform that's competing with Amazon called bookshop.org. You can order books through bookshop.org and support any local bookseller you want. The publishers have figured out the right marketing steps and production steps and a lot of decision making. So the businesses are healthy and not static, but there's like a stasis. It's not a state of emergency. And even through COVID, the big publishers were able to make adjustments. The big publishers have huge backlists. This means books that have sold 12 months prior. And people want to change that definition and talk about in the past, like 2 years prior or 3 years prior, to kind of understand what deep backlist is. So it's a healthy business, but so then to put it in this context, the forces on trade publishing is digital books and ebooks. Those have kind of balanced out. The number of people buying ebooks to physical books is not changing so much. So there's some stability. But there is the rise of Amazon that continues to be an issue. There is the issue of supply chain and having enough paper and having enough books and shipping books. So supply chain is an ongoing post-epidemic factor. And then the huge rise in self-publishing and hybrid publishing. And I had, if I can find it, just a little factoid in here. Of the 3.2 million titles that are tracked on BookScan, only 1% sold more than 5,000 copies.
Wow, that's a great
Okay,
factoid.
so 3.2 million
Startling.
titles. BookScan doesn't track everything, but it's all books kind of with a barcode and that can sell through retailers or online retailers. It's a pretty big sweep of the book selling environment and books available for sale, but not everything. 1% of that amount sold over 5,000 copies. And trade publishers, the big 5 trade publishers, make their profits on books that are selling over 3,000 copies, over 5,000, over 10,000. That's their business. The trade publishing business is much bigger. There's probably 25 big publishers. There's university presses. But for today, we're focused on these big 5. And I'll just list them out for you. Simon & Schuster, HarperCollins, Hachette, which includes Little Brown and Grand Central, many others, Macmillan, that includes St. Martin's for our Strauss-Giroux, Holt, and then the gigantic #1 publisher in the world, which is Penguin Random House. And the focus of this lawsuit is the merger between Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster. So
Right.
that's the lay of the land. Is that helpful, or there's some things to fill in or explain a bit more?
No, I think that is helpful. And as we've already alluded to, this business is no stranger to consolidation. And Penguin Random House itself, of course, was born of Penguin and Random House. It's a mashup of 2 right there. So why is this particular merger getting so much attention, and why is it under the eyes of the Department of Justice?
Right. So to put on my bigger, like, what I think of the world, and living in New York, and being aware of the business press, and not my area of expertise per se, but there is a little bit of fun backstory, which was when this merger started. All the companies are all this small amount of companies that are huge. They have so many imprints when you go to their website, and they have specialty imprints, children's imprints, business imprints, thriller imprints, mystery imprints, general nonfiction, upscale, downscale, the whole gamut, mass market. And it is getting more and more consolidated. And I think we've all been reading in the news, there's a concern about income inequality and what's happening in our society, and are the rich getting richer and the poor not be able to keep up. And so when we see these huge mergers, and these are billion-dollar companies, we talk about publishing being this small little business. It's
Mm-mm.
a huge industry. It's not so small. So I think what happened when this merger started, they actually through the due diligence, came up with some emails of some of these senior executives, like the top executives, saying, well, if we still have a Department of Justice, because it was the middle of the Trump administration, and we're not talking politics, it's just they were very business friendly. And they were had a very different relationship with the Department of Justice that was not independent. So there was sort of like, maybe we can just get this in under the radar because no one's looking at lack of competition. No one was looking at Google. No one was really looking at Amazon. Nobody was really looking at Netflix, like all these big companies. And it was like, oh, maybe we'll just get in under the radar, even though this consolidation from 6 to 5 to 4 is huge. And
Mhm.
then the new Department of Justice came in, and this is top of mind. And this was just the merger, one of the mergers that was in that sweep of company mergers. And I would add, people care about books, and a lot of people in government and a lot of people that are newsmakers and in the press all like to talk about publishing. They all have books. This is something that they think about. And so it's very topical. So that's kind of, could it have happened earlier with Penguin Random House merging? But there's been even so much more consolidation around that. They've swept up other smaller companies. So I think it's a tipping point.
Yeah, I would agree. So for the authors who are listening and the aspiring authors who are listening, and they know that they're initially at least going to head down this traditional path. If let's say this does go through, what does it mean for them? How would it impact a debut author, as I like to call them?
Yeah, I think the what was interesting about this lawsuit from the government to stop the merger is they were saying there's no harm to consumers, right? Like prices are not going to go up. It's probably not going to change the book buying environment. But the publishers all compete with each other, and most of your audience, those of you listening, don't realize that within these behemoth publishers now, with all these competing smaller publishers, what we call imprints, they compete with each other internally. And there are these rules that I lived through when I was still on that side of the desk of who can compete with whom. And we don't want to be just competing with each other and pushing up the price. It'd be like trying to buy a house with your mother wanting to buy it and you want to buy it. And you don't want to be, competing against your mom, right? You want to compete against some stranger you don't know. The publisher said, oh, but we're going to still have competition against each other. And we don't yet know if the government's going to believe that case, that point of view. But I think for the average writer, on a day-to-day basis on the acquisition front, so that's, you've got your book proposal, you've got a niche, you're going to, you're only going to be going to a big publisher if you have the ability to be part of a national conversation.
Mhm.
So if you have a strong B2B business, but not national visibility, and not a topic that's going to go national, you cannot be hugely well known, but have original research or have new data or have lived experience that's just right in the moment. Like race issues today, will be so topical, or some, I don't know, there's so many examples we could talk about. But today, if you fit and kind of can garner that attention and excitement, and you have a great proposal, I don't think if this merger went through in the near future, it will have a huge change. The change that happens over time is that the publishers, these imprints, actually start to merge. And over time, they don't advertise it, but having lived through the Penguin uh, Random House merger and the outcome of that over time, then they combine two business book imprints. Then they combine two kind of self-help imprints. And not only the acquisition, but the marketing. And so the way, that you have to prove yourself before you get marketing attention, they'll be great to you. There'll be a lot of support, but I think the impact is there's just not as much bandwidth. There are fewer people with so much. It's like another analogy. It's like trying to go to a restaurant and you can't rush the service anymore. We've all learned we have to be more patient because there's just not enough people. That's what publishing is turning into. Overworked people expected to think and do so much. And so over time, that care and that customization is going to go away if you don't break out.
Got it. Okay. And I've heard speculation that another possible or two other impacts from this could be decline in the average advance, again, especially for our debut authors, probably. Coming back to the lack of competition argument, and also longer timelines, which I think points to what you just said about there aren't as many people. That means it takes longer to get things done. So, what are your thoughts on those? And are there other impacts like that?
I've seen the impact on uh the length of time, which is so counterintuitive across the industry with the big trade publishers and the indie publishers. And whether that changes or not, I think is a bit of an unknown. I think when publishers want something, they move. And the big publishers, on the one hand, are strapped for time, but they do have the capacity to move if something is very timely.
Yeah.
That's where, you can get those bodies in place and they have the infrastructure and the clout to make things happen, but only if you're really wanted. I think in terms of advances, you know, it's a really good question. I think to some extent, advances have already taken a hit, and so many books are not being published. What we call the mid list, which are those in between books, those first books. Actually, it's usually the second book that's even harder. You can drum up the excitement for the first book, but the second book, if the first one doesn't perform, is the sophomore book is often harder.
Mhm.
But a lot of that has already disappeared because people say over and over again, I don't know how to publish it. I like this book, but I don't know what we're going to do with it.
Hmm.
And so, any of you listening, whether it's trade, hybrid, you're going to do it on your own. How do you answer that question? Who am I going to go to? So, I'm not sure that the advances are going to come way down, but the $100,000 advances are. And I have another little factoid that is it came up in the lawsuit. Um, Books that yield advances of $250,000 or more are the top 2% of all books acquired by the top five publishers, the big five. And it represents only about 1,000 authors.
Hmm.
I thought that was astounding. This is information that's new because of this lawsuit.
Yeah.
250,000 books dollars or more in advance. This means they pay the author. So the lion's share of books are going for advances that are 20,000 to 60,000 is kind of a tier, and another tier might be 80 to 150,000, and you can see how fast it might thin out from there. So
Mhm.
just a realistic perspective. There are always going to be people that overpay for these big books that everybody wants. And those are the ones you read about the newspaper, and the vast majority are going for that much smaller amount, just as information. And I don't know if that amount's going to come down a lot more, but that idea that books have to have that built-in audience already is just not going away. That is going up. The platform need for authors is going up with the trade publishers.
Yeah, you're right. Some of this information that we're finding in the transcripts, there's not a lot of transparency sometimes in this business. So it is nice to finally get a little peek behind the curtain and understand sort of what's going on behind the scenes. So I'm curious, and we touched on it at the top of the show, the impact on marketing support. If let's assume this does go through, we already talked about teams being stretched thin. It's sort of a universal complaint of authors to say they don't feel their publishers support them enough on the marketing side anyway. So, well, what might this do to that situation?
I think it adds to that stress, or maybe that push and pull between the big publishers, because we're focused on these huge national publishers. They have specialized lists. It's not all famous authors, but that's where the revenue is coming from. That's paying the salaries to buy the books you love. Sometimes
Mhm.
your boss will say, well, you can buy one book you love, and then the others have to make money, all these deals you make. Or we want the books that are going to get the awards, right? So it's a mix of factors. I do worry that if the focus is on those big national books, that you can lose the nuance and not have that boutique, more it's not just necessarily intellectual books, but the books that need to build and take time. And that's what my career was based on. And I would think that that's going to be harder to do. Publishers always have a short attention span. The book goes through the production cycle, and there's a marketing plan, and hopefully every book has a marketing plan, and hopefully you, if you're the author, or the authors, are learning from all the things they can learn online, and their agent and all that, and they're prepared, and the right things are happening. And you get some reviews, and you get the blogs, and the book starts to sell on Amazon, and all the right things happen. But if a month goes by and there's no momentum,
Yeah.
books can get cut off. And some publishers are famous for not following that track. Workman was one of the most famous. Many exceptions. Many of my friends, are not doing that. But that's the concern. Where's the uniqueness going to come from? That makes things stand out. And so then things start to look the same. So we say we want different voices, but when you only have 4 companies and those imprints do start to merge, or there's corporate oversight, so maybe some departments are separate, but more merge, how are you going to get that quirkiness into the marketing departments? There's the time factor, but the way we're thinking factor. And are we going to level out things because the standard becomes like one norm? And how are those things going to actually be compatible of uniqueness and freshness? Of course, a huge new memoir, a breakthrough novelist, Where the Crawdad Sings is a book people talk about. There are always the exceptions, but we're not focused on the exceptions. We're
Right.
not focused on those 2% of the books, or the 1% of the books I used with some of the stats. So I do think that that's a real risk.
Yeah. Hard to make money on exceptions.
Exactly. And so that's the whole point of this merger. Is it's that tipping point, right? It's just another wave where the scale is so huge, and the numbers of imprints are so big. And will they rationalize over time so that the number of imprints, does shrink? They have to. I mean, over time, as I say, it won't be immediate. If you have a good agent, I think for any individual author, an individual book transcends all the concerns, right? That's the wonderful thing about publishing. Any individual book can chart its own path, like any entrepreneur can chart their path and succeed. But when we look big picture, and you ask me for the risks, I think they're really real. And I think the case against the merger is very valid.
hmm Yeah, there are certainly a lot of nuances to the outcome if it were to go through. Changing gears a little bit. So, especially with this kind of hanging in the shadows here, how do you guide the authors? You mentioned you coach authors on the front end. So, how do you guide them through finding a publishing choice that might be appropriate for their situation? Are there certain criteria that you look for? Just talk us through that if you would.
There are, and it's very nuanced, but let me see if I could think of a few standout factors. Um, I think one is, how developed is the idea? How ready is the idea? Whether it's a narrative, I actually do work on memoirs because I love it. So it's not the lion's share of my business. I still do a little fiction. I published Barbara Kingsolver. I love to occasionally work on a novel. But even if it's an idea that's going to be a nonfiction, more issue-based book, or how-to book, or leadership book, how ripe and ready is the idea? If it's at an earlier stage, I will often recommend that somebody do a smaller book that won't affect their big book down the road, or self-publish, or do something hybrid, or do something just for clients, because it can be very distracting to try to get yourself ready for one of these big 5 publishers, or the 10 publishers. It takes all your eyes off the work you're doing, and you become focused on the book as a business,
Mm.
right? You get focused on writing this book proposal that has to leap off the page to get someone to say yes. And you most likely need an agent, though you might not if it's a smaller traditional publisher. So the ripeness of the idea, I say, is one. The next one I would say is the readiness and maturity of your marketing. So if you've never marketed, if you've never sold a course, if you've never run a workshop, like all those things, you learn so much. Having run my own 3-day conference for 4 years, you
I think
learn
I was a
so
speaker there.
yeah, Tanya was a speaker there. You learn so much by going through the process. And if you're starting a book without a running start, you don't really know the ropes. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know how to give your big trade publisher what they need, even if they grabbed onto the book. Your book proposal has to kind of have all of this, not guaranteed, but the proposal has to show you understand your audience and where you're going, and then and that you can pull it off at this very high level that maybe is not where your time should best be spent. You can do a really smart book that's more for a regional audience or a niche of an audience that could sell thousands of copies,
Mhm.
but it's not going to have that national, media interest, or if you can learn and grow, build as you grow, publish and expand. And I think the third thing is that national audience.
Mhm.
Is this who is my audience, and am I better looking for the exact right fit hybrid? Because it's just I can just say something about Greenleaf program. They have two imprints I've learned about recently. One is for women. I actually have a perfect project to possibly talk about. And these two women are huge forces in their worlds, amazing forces, national recognition, but the book they're collaborating on is starting from scratch. And so it's a great case example, maybe going the hybrid route. They can leverage all of their resources that are substantial why they developed their idea. And it's possible it could go to a trade publisher, but those are the questions: is, do you know who you're speaking to? And is it a large national audience, or would you be better going to university press, going to a hybrid publisher, going to the lefty press, going to the more conservative press, who's in your niche? And there are many smaller publishers that can do really right by authors.
Yeah, definitely. And we didn't really talk about self-publishing, but that's often a fine choice for certain types of authors. And I know you've got plenty of examples of when that route makes sense.
Totally. I think the hybrid thing where you get support is for somebody who has the resources. Self-publishing is like setting up your own business. And I recommend all that as well. If your audience is clear enough about the difference between self-publishing and hybrid. And hybrid, you get a lot more support and expertise and distribution, but it's more of an investment. And self-publishing is particularly great for fiction,
Mhm.
if you're going to have your own mystery series or whatever. So, but those are the big three, I think. How ready is your idea, how national is your audience, and how experienced are you with marketing and your audience and the platform that you have. That's where I start.
Yeah, that's great. And timeline too, I suppose. We talk to a lot of authors at Greenleaf who are in a real hurry for one reason or another to get their books out, and they've landed on our doorstep because they've realized on the traditional side, that's a pretty extended timeline between finding an agent and then getting the deal and then getting the book published. We're looking at
Yeah,
years.
I have two authors with huge, big trade books. They got these advances over 250,000. Now I have to say, I
Wow.
mean, I work with authors that are in the top 2%,
Yes, you
which
do.
I didn't know. Two of my most recent projects. And we worked on those for, 2 or 3 years, 6 months to a year on the proposal, because we were taking ideas that were very mature. They matched that, audiences that were clear, but getting it translated into a broad commercial and finding a kind of presentation and the right voice and getting all the pieces together when the first people I'm working with are awfully busy too. So it is like a startup,
Mhm,
right? So somebody is investing that time and they can't need the return on it in 6 months. So
mhm.
if you want to use it as like a loss leader or back of the room, which is great and you should, but you need something your first thing, going trade publishing would not be your first thing.
Absolutely.
Most 90%. I. I
Agreed.
always break my rules, but that's
Yeah,
another great
you're right.
criteria.
Because I've seen them crash titles, as we say, faster than any other publisher I know at a traditional house. So it happens.
But that's a great extra criteria, and I love that, because that proposal you have to be able to have that time, wrap your head around it, and get away. A lot of you are listening are very entrepreneurial, and you want to like go and then aim. This is the opposite. And the bigger the publisher, the longer the process. It's kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is. Well, you have given us so much amazing insight and perspective and advice today. Any other parting advice or thoughts for our listeners?
I think it's really exciting to publish. I mean, the process of crystallizing your ideas and sharing your voice is really powerful. And not everybody has to do it one way. I used to think not everyone had to have a book. That's not so much my thing, but I think with all the avenues, Tanya, you published a book, so that's a separate conversation. But you know so much, and it really crystallizes your way of thinking, and it's such a good practice for making your work meaningful, and also meeting a challenge. So I encourage everyone to strike out and go for it.
I love that. And yes, writing crystallizes thinking.
Thanks so much for
Janet.
having me.
Of course, we appreciate you. Thank you for joining us. That was great. That's it for our episode today with Janet. We hope you learned a few things about how this antitrust lawsuit might impact you as an author. For notes and resources from today's show, go to greenleafbookgroup.com/episode 66. You can also find advice for writing, publishing, and promoting your work in my book, Ideas, Influence, and Income, which you can learn more about at ideasinfluenceandincome.com. If you've enjoyed our show, please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you listen to your podcasts. It means a lot to have your feedback and helps us make sure we're answering your publishing questions. A big thank you to Eleanor Fishborn, who produces the published podcast, and we will be back next month with another new episode.
Thanks for listening to Published. To learn more, please visit greenleafbookgroup.com. And remember to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes.